Okay, welcome everybody to another Geo lecture. I'm really pleased to say that this week we're joined by Dr. Nick McGlynn from the University of Brighton. Nick's going to be talking about making LGBTQ communities and changing LGBTQ spaces. Before I let Nick take over, I just will say a couple of little bits about Geo for those who don't know. You can check out any of the upcoming lectures on the Geo website in the live events section. You will have the opportunity to watch the whole stream again at any point in the future, and that will just stay on the website in the past events section. We'll also upload this PowerPoint, so if you want to go back and refer to it later, then you're absolutely free to do so. We've got all of the past lectures from the last term as well up on the website, so do feel free to go back and have a look at those. If you have any questions or queries, we definitely really welcome those. So just leave a comment in the comment box on the right-hand side, and Nick, maybe we'll get to them during the talk, or we'll go through them at the end. Yeah, so I think that's it from me. So I'll hand over to Nick. Thanks, Nick.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Nick McGlynn, and I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Brighton. Apologies for the hat. It's not a fashion statement. I just have bad hair at the moment. So let me take you through what we're going to cover in today's lecture. So here's the things that I want you to kind of go away from this understanding. First of all, what have geographers done? Like, what does geography have to do with LGBTQ communities and issues? Secondly, the significance of space for LGBTQ communities. Then we're going to look at how they've changed, and you'll come away with a kind of a rough simplified chronology of some of those changes. And then this is the most complex and most highly geographic point at the end. We're going to think about how different spaces and places and the LGBT communities change one another. So there's a kind of feedback loop that emerges that we'll get into during this. So here's how I'm going to structure this. First, I'll give you a wee introduction to LGBTQ geographies, with a bit of my research as well. Secondly, we'll focus on the idea of making LGBTQ communities through space and place. And then third, I'm going to do a wee deep dive into LGBTQ spaces here in Brighton, and also touch on Manchester as well. So let's crack off with the introduction to LGBTQ geographies. So what have LGBTQ geographers done? What kind of stuff have they studied? Here's a quote taken from Aldrich's work, in which he argues that cities are incredibly closely connected to LGBTQ communities. Here's what he says. Historically, homosexuals formed urban networks of sociability and solidarity, and the presence of such minority communities impacted on urban development from Castro Street, that's in San Francisco, to Soho, that's in London. Homosexuals often moved to cities to escape the sexual and social constraints of traditional life. So he's imagining in the countryside here. The city, in turn, is the site of the construction of much contemporary gay and lesbian culture. What Aldrich is alluding to here is that the earliest geographic work focuses on cities and gay villages, gay neighbourhoods, and so on in particular. Aldrich suggests here that gay and lesbian culture are inherently linked with cities, and other scholars have even suggested that gay and lesbian identities are fundamentally at heart an urban phenomenon, one made possible only by the large populations and mixed populations of urban space. Now, there are good reasons for this, such as people's imagined features of cities, the idea that you can be anonymous in a city, that you can be free from being spotted by your nosy homophobic neighbours, the idea that there are many sexual partners available, the idea that cities are more accepting of sexual and gender diversity, and that cities are just more cosmopolitan kinds of places. I'm not going to suggest that lots of LGBTQ people don't work, live and socialise in cities. We know that that is the case. But I do want to quickly highlight two key ways in which we can critically examine this image from a geographic perspective. So is LGBTQ geography just about gay neighbourhoods in big cities? Well, not for many decades now, and in fact LGBTQ geographers have been at the forefront of critiquing that focus, and they've done that in two ways. First of all, LGBTQ geographers have been critical of that focus, not just on cities, but on big cities, the metropolis, London, New York, Mexico City, Paris, Tokyo. This is a trend that the queer theorist Jack Halberstam describes as metronormativity, the focus on the metropolis. Now, increasingly, geographers, myself included, have used our research to point out that there are plenty of LGBTQ people in rural areas, and they are not always sad, scared, and closeted, but in many cases just actively prefer the countryside to the big city. The countryside has a strong pull for many LGBTQ people. Secondly, other geographers have pointed out rightly that this earlier scholarship, very valuable though it is, it didn't only limit its focus to cities, but it also limited itself to gay and lesbian people primarily. Much, much less geographic scholarship has been focused on bisexual people, on trans, non-binary and genderqueer people, on asexual and aromantic people. This is increasingly now being tackled by geographers. We've had a glut of fantastic bi-geographies over the recent years. I've got a PhD student who's now working on asexual geographies. So there's a lot more scope for more geographic research on bi, trans, queer people, the spaces that they use, the spaces they create, that they travel through, and so on. But that does mean that for this lecture that I'm giving you now, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of the research that I'll be discussing, I have to admit, it is based primarily on gay men and lesbians, or at least those who were presumed to be gay men and lesbians by researchers at the time. That is not my desire to exclude others from the LGBTQ spectrum at all, but I am limited by what research is out there. At the end, in the comments, I would be happy to point folk towards any of this kind of new and cutting edge LGBTQ geographic research. So here's how I fit into this, which I thought would be useful for you to think about at the start. So my research on LGBTQ geographies started by basically what is it like to do LGBTQ activism near Brighton, but not actually in Brighton. So in the kind of more rural places surrounding it. And I was interested in how the very idea of urban and rural was impacting on campaigning, activism, policy making for LGBTQ equalities in those areas. I've also focused my work quite a lot on public sector equalities work. That is what the NHS, the police, local councils, policy making does for LGBTQ people from a geographic perspective. For example, mapping the implementation of that across the UK. I'm also extremely interested in LGBTQ spaces and scenes, and that's what I'm going to be primarily talking to you today about. And finally, my kind of current research is about fatness. I'm interested in what it's like to be fat in LGBTQ spaces and how they can be exclusionary spaces for bigger people. So let's now move into what I'm primarily going to be focusing on today, which is how we make LGBTQ communities through space and place. So I'm going to take you through a kind of chronology here. It's an extreme, I'll be saying this a few times, it's an extremely simplified chronology. I don't want you to go away thinking, I've got it, I've got all the answers here, I'm done, I don't need to learn anything else. So I am simplifying it for you, but it will help you kind of trace the trajectory of how LGBTQ spaces have shaped LGBTQ communities. So let's start out with the very idea of LGBTQ spaces and consider why it is that they're important. The image that you can see here was taken in 1999. This is the immediate aftermath of one of the most violent attacks on LGBTQ people in the UK. In 1999, a self-described racist and homophobe detonated a nail bomb at the Admiral Duncan pub in Soho in London, which you can see blown out here. Killed 3 people and seriously injured 70 others. The bomber had also attacked London's Desi communities in Brixton and Brick Lane in previous weeks. Nowadays, the Admiral Duncan bombing is remembered by a yearly memorial event, helping maintain the feeling of Soho as a kind of nexus for gay communities. The memorialisation of this brutal event nevertheless helps us to think about the aspects of LGBTQ spaces which have made them important in the past and continue to make them important for us now. And for people marginalised still on account of their sexuality and their gender identity. LGBTQ spaces have historically been felt by people to be a place to be yourself, to a historically safe space to hide away from a predominantly heterosexualized and cisgendered world, and to reveal and even revel in your true self. But not just this, they're also spaces where a sense of identity, where a sense that you have a true self, and what the nature of that true self is actually created. It's created by who else is there, by how you feel when you're in that space, what you do when you're there, what you learn when you're there. You can come to understand yourself by going to these spaces as, oh, I'm a particular type of person. I get it now, I'm a gay man, or I get it now, I'm a lesbian, rather than just a woman who just happens to like to make out with other women. So LGBTQ spaces are spaces where LGBTQ identities and communities are made and produced. That's what we're going to focus on in this section. So it's this idea of how spaces have made LGBTQ identities and communities, and also anxieties about what might be happening in LGBTQ spaces now, that we're going to start looking at. So I'll take you through, remember, a simplified timeline of LGBTQ spaces, and also another crucially geographic caveat that this is primarily focused on the global north, and I'm going to show how these spaces relate to the growth in LGBTQ communities. So traveling back in time, we are going back to the kind of late Victorian periods up until around the kind of time of World War II. So I've kind of described this kind of like 1890s to 1840s. There were queer cultures happening back then, and they, interestingly enough, described themselves as queer. Queer as a term for men who are attracted to men, for example, has existed a lot longer than gay has. In these earlier queer cultures, queer men in particular moved venues very frequently to avoid police harassment or when they were kicked out by staff. The kind of spaces that were used were predominantly public spaces and spaces that were mixed. They were not separate private queer spaces. The kinds of spaces that I'm talking about here are public alleyways, the street, parks, and toilets, public toilets, as you can see in the image on the left-hand side here. These were sites of public sex cultures amongst queer people, as well as just of queer socialising. Another example of a popular urban space used by queer people to socialise is on the right-hand side here. This building you can see, which I believe that's actually an Oxford Circus in London. A very popular urban space for queer people to socialise in the 30s and 40s was this, a Lion's Corner house. Think of this as like the Starbucks of its day, national chain, except much, much bigger, very large, multi-levels, as you can see here, and they incorporated cafes, restaurants, musical entertainments. I'm not sure we really have anything like that in the UK anymore. Now, this is the kind of space that queer people were using to socialise. Mixed spaces, open to everybody. Now, while we could technically maybe think of these as queer or LGBTQ spaces, they certainly weren't officially so, and the queer clients tended to make very temporary use of these spaces. They were very often policed, either by the actual police or by the staff of the Lion's Corner house, if the queer clientele was felt to be too visible about their queerness to others. Now, so there were certainly communities that I think we could talk about here, but they were quite fragmented, as I'm sure you can understand, quite transitory and quite temporary. So let's move on from this period into the kind of the post-World War II period now, and this is where things really start to change. So we're now shifting into the kind of the late 40s and especially into the 50s and 60s. What we see during this period in the global north is an increasing shift to private gay venues. The things that we're now much more familiar with, LGBTQ clubs, bars, saunas. Over the decades after World War II, word began to spread about particular bars and clubs in which LGBTQ people began to socialise, especially private venues aimed explicitly at queer men, but also bars, pubs and clubs which became known as lesbian venues too. You can see an example, a very famous example of this on the left-hand side here. This is the Gateways Club in London. Even sex spaces became privatised in this way. So on the right-hand side, you can see an example of a gay sauna, large venues for men to have sex in, certainly, but also with a very strong socialising element in them as well. This altered the previous situation in which queer people used relatively public spaces for their socialising. As private queer venues like these clubs, these bars, these pubs, even the saunas, as these grew in number and popularity and as word of them spread, queer people became less visible in public and had less interaction with the general public because they were moving into these kind of closed off private spaces. Now, that had both liberatory and exclusionary elements. On the one hand, many LGBTQ people were delighted to socialise in what they felt were safe and respectable places, free of police surveillance, and with a degree of privacy from mainstream society. And I mean, look, the guys on the right-hand side, spoiler alert, they're models. But the women on the left-hand side, they're having a good time. They clearly like the environment that they're in. So these sites, as well as providing a sense of safety, were also crucial to creating a new sense of community. By visiting particular spaces, you become part of a community. Imagine that you're going to, say you're going to the Gateways. You go there like once a week or something for a drink. You see the same people. You share jokes and discussions. You talk about particular singers and songs. Who is K.D. Lang? What is the book The Well of Loneliness? You see adverts for local LGBTQ events, groups, services. You see adverts about sexual health information. You start to pick up all of these cultural tropes, this information. So by going to these spaces, LGBTQ people now begin to feel they're not just an isolated type of person, but they're part of something bigger. So this marks a profound shift in urban queer scenes, spaces and communities. I did say there was an exclusionary aspect to this as well. While the growth in private venues was certainly vital in creating LGBTQ communities, it's worth noting that just as today, there were LGBTQ people who can't afford to go to access these gay bars or these lesbian bars, and they thus experienced a bit of exclusion and separation from these communities. This is something we're going to come back to later on in today's lecture. Let's move us forward through time now to another kind of spatial shift. So now we're pushing into the 1970s, the 80s and the 90s. And what we see developing here are urban gay neighbourhoods, villages, sometimes called ghettos. It wasn't really until the mid to late 20th century, this kind of period, that distinct gay areas, LGBTQ areas, as we might now understand them, began to congeal in some cities. By the 80s and 90s, more concrete gay and LGBTQ spaces and scenes, not just individual spaces, but whole scenes, were emerging with some fixed and explicitly LGBTQ spaces like bars, cafes, clubs, shops, and so on. So examples of these kind of areas might be Soho in London, down here, Kemp Town in Brighton, Canal Street in Manchester, Christopher Street in New York, which is shown here, Freikaneka Street in Sao Paulo, Shinjuku Nichome in Tokyo, and lots of others. In this way, these kind of gay villages become centres of LGBTQ community and consumption. So we might call this a kind of queering of straight public space. These villages spill out into what was formerly a kind of straight mainstream public. They further strengthen and develop feelings and practices of LGBTQ communities and identities, because now you start to get a critical mass of LGBTQ people together in public space, at times more of them than straight cisgender people, and feeling a sense of ownership. Look at the banner these people are carrying here, a sense of empowerment about being in this space, in an area that's not just closed off, it's not hidden away just in private bars and clubs. It is, as you can see here, highly visible and blended within public space. Let's push us now through one more step of this chronology. Now we're coming more into the present day, so we're kind of pushing into the kind of the 2000s and the 2010s. I realise that we're now into the 2020s, but give me a break, I'm an old person. So what we're seeing at this period is a new opening up and a mixing of what were formerly LGBTQ spaces. So across the UK and beyond, many bars and other LGBTQ spaces have been rebranding themselves or reframing themselves as not just gay bars, not just LGBTQ spaces, but as LGBTQ friendly. So this is a shift that's happening now with more and more straight and cisgender people wanting to come into and use LGBTQ venues. Now, remember that LGBTQ spaces and that sense of togetherness that they create has been central in making LGBTQ communities. So it's probably not surprising to find that many LGBTQ people report feelings of ambivalence or even anxiety about the greater numbers of straight people in and using these spaces. People fearing for their safety, people experiencing casual homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and also just a general sense that this feeling of community is slowly being diluted, is weakening over time. Another contemporary anxiety about these spaces is that this mixing doesn't seem to be just a matter of greater inclusivity, and it certainly doesn't point to the lack of a need for LGBTQ spaces. In fact, what seems to be the issue most of the time is trying to pay the rent, is trying to actually keep the place open. LGBTQ venues are closing across the country. Lesbian and queer women spaces in particular have been virtually wiped out in the UK. Candy Bar, London's most famous bar for lesbian, bi and queer women, closed in 2014, as did the famous drag and burlesque venue, Madame Jojo's. I think She Soho here on the left-hand side might be the only lesbian bar left in the UK. And look at what they've got on their sign here. It says She Soho, strictly no unaccompanied men, a lesbian venue for ladies and their guests. So they're kind of trying to negotiate this kind of mixing. They're not saying it's lesbian only, but they're trying to kind of establish some, if not kind of boundaries, to say, look, this is the kind of space we want this to be. We don't want it to kind of be weakened too much. With regard to other kinds of spaces, I mentioned saunas previously. There's very few saunas left. Rent prices for venues are increasing across the country, and new areas of LGBTQ socialising, of community, have certainly opened up across the country, especially across London. But a lot of these new spaces tend to be things like big ticketed temporary dance events and club nights. Actual permanent venues like She Soho and on the right hand side here, Brighton's own Club Revenge, really struggle to stay open. Here in Brighton, we've had 2 LGBTQ bars close just over the past year. No doubt impacted by COVID, but have been financially struggling long before that. And others have indicated that they might close in the future. In London, there have been protests and campaigns to try to save some spaces, which tells you how important LGBTQ communities feel these spaces are. Some of those campaigns have been successful, some of them have been unsuccessful. So there are real and justified fears for LGBTQ venues and that sense of community that they've created as we now look ahead into the future. So I've given you a wee an historical overview to kind of trace the importance of creating LGBTQ community through LGBTQ spaces. Now I want to build on that a little bit. As I said, it's a simplified chronology. So I'm now going to explain how LGBTQ spaces are, well, I'm going to dig into some of the specifics of it. I'm going to look at some of the changes specifically here in Brighton, and also a bit later on in Manchester. Significantly here, I'm going to point out how not just how LGBTQ spaces have changed, but how they have changed their surrounding areas. So I'm going to think about the impacts that LGBTQ communities and spaces have on the areas within which they sit. So let's come to Brighton. This is a quote taken from a fantastic book called Daring Hearts. It's quite difficult to get your hands on now. Daring Hearts was published in the 1990s, and it is a fantastic collection of very beautiful, very honest stories from LGBTQ people in Brighton, who were in Brighton in the 50s and 60s. And it really, I mean, throughout, it is just dripping with fantastic geographic detail. It really is a goldmine of data for somebody who wants to use it for analysis. Here's what one of their respondents said about being in Brighton as a lesbian in the 1960s and 50s and 60s. This respondent says, "We came down on holiday, a week's holiday, and it was the freedom in Brighton. There were so many gay people and they seemed to be accepted, and there were clubs for gay people. Brighton's gay now," this was in the 90s, "but it was very, very gay then." Other respondents talk about the idea that Brighton felt like a different world at the time, completely different to anywhere else. And so what we start to see happening in this period, as evidenced through the data in Daring Hearts and so on, is the growth in a critical mass of gay and lesbian people down here. It's clear that there is still a great deal of hostility and a lack of support, but one of the big things that they point out all the way through the book is the importance of the spaces. I mean, you can see the respondent says it right there. There were clubs for gay people. Let's take a look at some of these spaces, because again, as I said, I'm goldmine for geographers. What was the first thing that I found when I turned the page? A map, and my eyes lit up with delight. So this is a little map that Daring Hearts included, which maps out what they describe as gay and lesbian spaces. I think looking through the book, it would be accurate to describe them as LGBTQ spaces from 1950 to 1969. Now, we are probably now used to almost all LGBTQ spaces being bars, pubs, clubs, etc. But from that wee history that I talked you through in the previous section, you know now that's not all there has been. So this research was about Brighton in the 50s and 60s. So we're at a kind of a transitory period in that simplified chronology that I gave you. This is the kind of time when the use of mixed public space, the Lions corner houses, the public toilets and so on, for LGBTQ socialising is in decline. And more private LGBTQ venues are being established. So it's a kind of transitory position in that chronology. Now we can see some evidence of that here. If we have a look at what they've chosen to pick out here. For example, I've mentioned the kind of the use of public toilets in the past. That's evidence in this. If you look at point number 19, it says Black Lion Street Cottage. Those who are unfamiliar with kind of historical gay culture might be thinking, oh, it's a nice little quaint cottage, but actually a cottage is a kind of an older gay culture name for a public toilet where like gay men would kind of gather, sometimes for sex, sometimes for kind of socializing purposes. So what they're actually talking about here is that there is a public toilet which was in Black Lion Street. The public toilet doesn't exist today, but the kind of steps that used to lead down to it still exist. That's something they've picked out as an important space in the city then. So we can still see that earlier history represented in this map here. But we can also see plenty of evidence of more private venues as well, many of which have been picked out here. You can see lots of these are bars, pubs and clubs. There's a couple of other things. There's a bookshop. There's a research group. So that number one, the minorities research group, that's a kind of a lesbian and gay activist group there. But let's take a look at a couple of the private venues to kind of fit this better into this wee chronology that I've given you. So the first one that I wanted to pick out is called Piggott's. Now the venue, the space still exists today, but it's not called that anymore. On this circle image that I've picked out for you, the bar on the right-hand side of it is the name slightly cut off. That is the St James Street Tavern. And it's still there. I've been in for a few drinks myself. That's still on St James Street, right in the centre of Brighton. But it didn't used to be the St James Street Tavern. It used to be called Piggott's in the 1950s. Let's take a look at what one of the respondents from Daring Hearts says about it. This respondent says, I started going to Piggott's in 1950 when I was 20, and it was mostly girls, but there were 1 or 2 men there. This little lady used to play at the piano with her jangling bracelet, cigarette hanging on her mouth. And we used to have this sing-song, the old tunes. It was terribly small. There was room enough for a piano and there weren't many seats. It was quite tatty, all really dark brown. It was just ordinary working class. There weren't any professionals there. So you can see this is a far cry from the kind of like stylish gay bars that have become popularized now. Let's take a look at another, well, and certainly you can see that that's primarily for girls. So it's seen as more of a kind of a lesbian venue, not exclusively, but predominantly. Let's take a look at another example. This one is, Brighton's not a big place, so it really is not far away. It's probably like a 10-minute walk, if that. This is the Greyhound, and it still exists today, but it's not called that anymore. This place has gone through a pile of names in the years that I've lived in Brighton. It used to be the Goldfish Bowl, I think, and now it's called the East Street Tap. But the East Street Tap used to be called something else. Before it was even the Goldfish Bowl, it was the Greyhound. Let's take a look at what some of the respondents say about the Greyhound. So reflecting on his experiences, one guy says, we decided to go into this gay bar, the Greyhound. Steve and I fell in the door, and to our horror, we found we were in a heterosexual bar, and the gay bar was upstairs. So I lowered my voice and went, brown ale, please. My best heterosexual voice. Suddenly, out of the corner of our eye, we saw all these people trooping upstairs. And I can't tell you how much courage it took to walk from that bar to go up those stairs. Because what you were actually doing in front of all those people was saying, I'm one of them. I'm a gay man too. So I think this one is really interesting because it really emphasizes that Brighton is in this transitional phase. With some degree of mixed use of space. So you can see the downstairs here is the heterosexual bar and the upstairs is the gay bar. And that clearly there's significant overlap between the clientele because you have to literally walk past and through the straight venue, and sometimes people are getting confused, they're going to the wrong one. So it really emphasizes this transitional phase that we're in with some mixed use of space, but increasing spatial separation. Straight downstairs, gay upstairs, and you can be identified as one of them if you go up. So that's a little bit of the kind of history of gay space in Brighton. And then Brighton develops this sense of being a kind of a famous place for LGBTQ people to come to. You can see it had that reputation even back in the 50s and 60s. That's done something to the city. That's increased over time. Nowadays, people often talk about Brighton as the gay capital of the UK. I know Manchester and London would both disagree. But it's become a very popular archetype, what in geography we might call a geographic imaginary of the city, that it's the gay capital, that it's an LGBTQ city. And that's done stuff to the city. That's changed the city. The LGBTQ communities and spaces have actually changed the city. That's what we're going to take a look at now. So we looked at how LGBTQ spaces in Brighton have changed over the decades, and we mapped that a wee bit onto that chronology that I gave you. But we can also examine how Brighton as a city as a whole has been changed by the presence of LGBTQ communities and spaces. So here I'm drawing on work by Professor Kath Brown. On the right-hand side here, used to be based here at the University of Brighton. She's now back in Ireland, and also by a local researcher activist, Leela Bakshi. And together, they've written this book, Ordinary in Brighton, which is specifically about this idea of Brighton as the gay capital and thinking, how has that transformed the city? What has it done to the city? Let's take a look at some of the things they say. The idea of Brighton as a gay capital, the gay spaces, the LGBTQ communities in the city has done to Brighton. The first thing they point out is that the existence of LGBTQ spaces here has had a profound economic impact in the city. It's brought in huge numbers of tourists, people who come down to visit the LGBTQ spaces of the city. maybe just LGBTQ people who just come down because they've heard of Brighton is associated with LGBTQ communities, they want to see it. And then, of course, you've also got the titan that is Brighton Pride. Once a year, tens of thousands of people flooding into the city with a huge economic impact to the city, bringing tons of money into it. It's become a really significant part of Brighton's marketing to tourists, to day trippers and so on. And it's also created businesses down here. So a lot of these venues are, but the vast majority of them, they are businesses. Places like Club Revenge, like Velvet Jack's, which is a lesbian cafe on the left-hand side here. They couldn't exist without this kind of idea of Brighton being an LGBTQ space. That's kind of how they're economically viable. So this is the first transformation to the city they've pointed out. It's had a massive economic impact in the city. It brings tons of money into the city and supports the city's sustainability. Second, they point out the large number of different services and charities which can exist within the city because of its large LGBTQ communities and their spaces. So things like sexual health charities, of which we have a lot down here, targeted support for trans people, specific support groups and campaigns for people living with HIV and AIDS, and also the large number of specific services for LGBTQ people, like our youth group, All Sorts, and our LGBTQ mental health charity, Mind Out. All of these can only exist because of the bringing of many LGBTQ people into the city, the creation of that critical mass. That is what sustains and makes all of this stuff viable. That's why these exist. That's why the buildings that they occupy exist. That's why the people who work in them have their jobs. So you can see, again, a huge impact in the city here. Finally, is with regard to policy making, a particular interest of mine. Brighton as a city has had this kind of sense of empowerment of its LGBTQ communities. I feel that myself sometimes, being a gay man here as well. Sometimes this kind of sense of, you can't treat me like this is Brighton, no matter what's happened. Like, they've run out of croissants somewhere and I'm like, this is homophobia. What's happened in the city is that LGBTQ communities, because of this critical mass that are increasingly drawn to the city because of its spaces, they feel a sense of empowerment and they say, you can't treat us like this, we're going to do something about it. And the city council, the city authorities have gotten wise to this, and they now know that they need to do targeted consultations with LGBTQ communities. They need to implement particular programs and policies to support LGBTQ communities, because people are going to shout if they don't. And it's also seen as part of the city's heritage now. On the bottom right here, you can see the AIDS Memorial statue, which is in Euston, a small park just up towards Kemp Town. That exists because of these LGBTQ communities and spaces. So this is what Brown and Bakshi point out as some of the many impacts that bringing LGBTQ communities to Brighton has had on the wider city. Economic, in terms of its services and charities, and in terms of the actual politics and policy making of the city. So it's not just that LGBTQ spaces exist. And it's not just that they impact on LGBTQ people, they also impact on the wider city as well, for non-LGBTQ people. Now, from the economic impacts in particular, you might have already guessed that Brighton has become very interested in marketing itself to day trippers, marketing itself to tourists, marketing itself to potential new residents, even to potential students, like maybe some of you. And it does this marketing by promoting its LGBTQ spaces. Now, that kind of marketing can feedback and have a kind of feedback loop and impact on LGBTQ spaces. The communities impacting the city, transforming it in these ways. And then in turn, that has an impact on LGBTQ communities. What have some of these impacts been on LGBTQ communities? Well, at this point, I want to make a wee jump. I'm going to take us away from Brighton for a second and take us up to Manchester. Because I want to think about what happens when LGBTQ spaces become popular. How does that transform those spaces? We're seeing similar processes in Brighton, but I thought Manchester has a bit more kind of material for us to kind of look at here. So one of the things that has had a massive impact on Manchester's LGBTQ spaces. Oh, sorry, that's pops up a YouTube link, which I thought I had removed. It doesn't matter. One of the things that I want to talk about with Manchester is how Canal Street, the kind of gay village of Manchester, has become incredibly popular as a place to visit. And part of the reason for that has been TV shows like Queer as Folk. Which I showed you an image of there. I was going to show you a video of it, but I know it's not going to kind of show well on this screen. So I'll kind of pop a link into the notes, which you can download afterwards. I will say that this is age restricted, so it's 16 plus. So if you're 16 or under, please don't watch it because there's naughty stuff in it. I was only going to show you this non-rude bit anyway. And the non-rude bit I was going to show you was how TV programmes like Queer as Folk portrayed Manchester. Now, I remember Queer as Folk, the original one, was on in the kind of late 90s. And I remember that was the kind of period where I was kind of like coming out to myself. And I saw Queer as Folk on TV, like as many kind of gay men of my era did, huddled in my bedroom late at night with this tiny TV watching it. And as I watched all this stuff happening on the screen, and I saw what Canal Street was like, it was the first time in the late 90s, it was the first time that I'd ever seen LGBTQ people being cool. It was the first time that I'd ever looked at them and on TV and seen anything except them dying, sad, miserable, alone. Instead, in Queer as Folk, they were having fun. It looked brilliant. It looked a fantastic place that I wanted to go to. That had a massive impact in the city. Queer as Folk was a huge kind of phenomenon at the time. It was watched by everybody. You can probably see similar stuff nowadays with Russell T Davies' new series, It's a Sin, which I've not watched, not because of the trauma of HIV and AIDS, but because I don't want to watch people going out and having fun at the moment, because I can't do it. But this is the kind of impact that it's had on Manchester. Suddenly, people are watching Queer as Folk and they go, wow, Manchester looks fantastic. Canal Street looks like a riot. I want to go there and check that place out. That had a really significant impact on Canal Street. So Kathleen Leela, discussing Brighton, pointed out that LGBTQ spaces have increasingly become part of a kind of urban regeneration project in Brighton. These kind of projects link LGBTQ lives and our spaces with being modern, with being fun, with being accepting, with being diverse. And as part of bringing money into the city, urban authorities are increasingly interested in using these images to bring people into the city. And they want to do something to the spaces as well. They regulate the spaces, they clean up the spaces at the same time as they're promoting them. Similar things have been seen in Manchester in the wake of things like Queer as Folk and other TV series which came afterwards. The city council and local businesses suddenly realised that this was a huge part of bringing investment into the city, not just through tourism, but by people seeing that and thinking Manchester looks like a fun, accepting, welcoming place to live in. So in the wake of Queer as Folk, you get the Canal Street area tidied up, cleaned up. You get it officially branded, as you can see. I don't know why I keep pointing this way. My screen's that way. You can see they put up these signs that say things like Manchester's Gay Village, so an official stamp on it from the city authorities. They create colourful and eye-catching street art, some of which you can see here, to promote its LGBTQ heritage. And they actively use the kind of nostalgic popularity of TV shows like Queer as Folk. So on the bottom here, you can see this club, Babylon. Babylon was kind of the big club in the TV series Queer as Folk. Didn't really exist. It's actually a real club in Manchester called Cruise 101, which transformed into Babylon last year, I think it was, to celebrate the anniversary of Queer as Folk. So suddenly, LGBTQ spaces are super popular, and city authorities and local businesses are interested in using that, but also in tidying them up, in cleaning these spaces up, in managing and regulating these areas. So as the editor of one local LGBTQ magazine talking about Canal Street, so that here's the quote that he gives, again, in the wake of Queer as Folk. He says, previously, Canal Street, was a very downtrodden part of the city centre, and it isn't now. It's now the most desirable part. It is the part that is projected across the world as the face of the new Manchester. Now, that might seem lovely, But it has not been without controversy, either in Manchester or similar processes here in Brighton. There have been complaints from Manchester's LGBTQ communities who argued that due to the marketing and the popularisation of the Canal Street area, and the council's increasing control over it, the area has become less free, less open, too clean, too full of straight people, thinking back to those anxieties I noticed in the previous section. And it's worth noting that even straight people who go to the area regularly complain there are too many straight people there. And also, one of the other complaints that emerges is that the area's become too working class, that there are too many poor people there. This is something that I want to come to in the end. This idea that the popularisation of Manchester's and Brighton's LGBTQ spaces means that they've become too working class, that there are too many poorer people there, brings me to the final point this afternoon. This is about various forms of inclusion and exclusion in LGBTQ spaces, which I hinted at way back toward the start. There's no doubt that the majority of LGBTQ spaces are focused around consumption, especially bars, pubs and clubs. It's about buying things. Now, we've looked at how important LGBTQ spaces are as sites of identity development, safety, community building, information and support and so on. If it's the case that LGBTQ people have to consume, they have to be able to pay to buy things, to enter the spaces, to consume things there, their ability to spend money, what does that mean for people who continue to not be able to afford to go into these spaces? People who can't afford expensive drinks or lots of drinks. Also maybe even people who can't be in spaces with alcohol, people who've experienced alcohol problems and so on. Is it the case that you need to be able to pay to kind of access LGBTQ community through these spaces? The kind of consumption that happens in these spaces also produces kind of senses of who LGBTQ people are. They very often focus on younger LGBTQ people, gym fit people, white or light-skinned people, attractive people, able-bodied people, and cis-passing trans people. So aside from issues regarding money and income, access to these spaces and participation in these spaces can also be limited in a number of ways. Now, these inclusions and exclusions is something that geographers have become really interested in, myself included. And also, I mean, I've got two third-year geographer students at the moment doing their final year dissertations on exactly this topic of access to LGBTQ space. Who can afford to access community in these spaces? So these are very significant and ongoing issues with LGBTQ spaces looking ahead into the future. So let's wrap up what we've covered today. First of all, I've hopefully suggested that geographers, we do more than just about kind of like gay neighbourhoods, which is where the kind of initial work was. There's a lot of stuff on smaller spaces as well, the kind of micro geographies of particular LGBTQ venues and the history of them too. Secondly, I've tried to explain how LGBTQ spaces, they're not just where LGBTQ communities are, they help create them. They actively help produce that sense of community. And finally, I've explained to you how these spaces have been changing, what some of the issues have been with those changes, and how those issues might be kind of looking now as we move forward into the future. So that's us for today. Just to wrap up, I would never leave without giving you some homework to do. So if you want to kind of look up any of the text that I've used in this, I've given you a few examples that you can look up here. Aldrich's work, Binney and Skeggs on Manchester in the wake of Queer as Folk, the Brighton Our Story Project's Daring Hearts book, and Kath Brown and Leela Bakshi's work on LGBTQ Brighton as the gay capital. So that's us for now. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be delighted to hear any questions or give you any kind of guidance or tips.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. That was really, really, really good, really interesting. Lots of stuff to go at there, I think. Yeah, so I'm going to just give people maybe just 30 seconds to leave any questions they may have in the comment box, if there are any. Once again, I'll just remind you, while you're potentially asking any questions, that you can watch the full replay of this video on the Geo website. It'll be the past events section, and we'll upload the full PowerPoint so you can go in there, have a look at it all again. You can check out that video that Nick mentioned in your own time, and yeah, and please do keep checking out the future events that we'll be putting up on the website as they come out over the next few weeks. I don't think there are any questions today, so I think we'll leave it there. So once again, thanks Nick for your time and for joining us today. Thank you everybody for watching, and yeah, we'll see you next time.